Hello and welcome to Unit 2. Today we will be discussing the contribution to British Cultural Studies by the Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies, also known as the Birmingham School of Thought. By now you should have read Raymond Williams' Culture is Ordinary and been introduced to his concept of culturalism, as that is what he was discussing in the reading that was assigned to you last week. The reason for me introducing you to Williams and his concept of culturalism is that Williams and the Birmingham School's founding director Richard Hoggart both came from similar academic backgrounds. Both were literary students from working class backgrounds. Both stood in opposition to the Eliot Leavers tradition and the aristocratic notions they implied. And it's generally accepted that Hoggart's agenda for the centre was in response to two main texts published in the 50s and the 60s, Hoggart's 1957 Uses of Literacy and Williams' 1958 book Culture and Society. These texts had in common a concern with the social and cultural plight of the working classes and redefining traditional elitist notions of education. Yet they were also concerned with defining a common culture that would be able to include popular and mass-mediated culture, and it was these literary tenets that the school was born from, and hopefully you'll be able to see how at the time these unpopular notions were instrumental in setting up the centre and creating its focus. So, by the end of this lecture, I would hope you to meet three learning outcomes. I would like you to have an understanding of the historical origin and outputs of the Birmingham Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies, which will also be called either the Centre or the school throughout the lecture. To be aware of the school's contribution to cultural studies. And lastly, understand the importance of structuralism and Marxism in relation to the school's theoretical background. So, the school was known for its contributions to the discipline of culture. Its main focus of research was class, culture and communication. As you can see, it studied many diverse areas such as ethnicity, popular culture, feminism, youth subcultures and mass media. It put a new slant on deviance, which was in contrast to its North American counterpart, the Chicago School. It applied a critical view to culture and relied on cross-disciplinary, collaborative research to produce what was termed as working papers that then became seminal texts within cultural studies. Due to its innovative approach that relied on collaboration and the mixing of different disciplines, it created many influential theorists and seminal texts within the realm. I'm sure you'll recognise some of these theorists such as Dick Hebbage, Dorothy Hobson, David Morley, Phil Cohen, Chas Critcher, Paul Willis, Angela McRobbie, Richard Hoggart and Stuart Hall. So we'll be discussing some of the main contributions from some of these theorists today. Now, before we begin to discuss the contributions, it's essential we look at the theoretical context that created the focus of the school. As previously stated, the school was founded by Richard Hoggart, who was initially an English professor who had acquired acclaim throughout his book The Art of Literacy. Much of the theoretical background to the school came from Hoggart's linguistic background, coupled with his deputy's background, Stuart Hall, a neo-Marxist. To understand the theoretical context of the school, we need to have a base understanding of structuralism and Marxism, in particular those that we discussed at the face-to-face day, as each of these theories informed how the school approached their research and shaped their understanding of the social world. So firstly, we'll have a quick look at the concept of structuralism, looking at Saussure and the emergence of the concept, followed by the theorist Levi Strauss, and then we'll move on to discuss Marxists such as Althusser and Gramsci. Once we have this base understanding and the contribution these theorists made, we'll be able to understand how the school's theoretical background was developed. So structuralism. The concept of structuralism has its origins with the work of Saussure in the 1900s. Saussure was a linguistic and he created structuralism as a method of analysing language. He believed language was a sign system, or you could say structure rather than sign system, whose individual components could only be understood in relation to each other and to the system as a whole. He states a language is a system in which all the elements fit together and in which the value of any one element depends on the simultaneous coexistence of all others. For example, we know when we speak of black, the colour black, we know by its distinction to other colours it is black, not white. The structure of language was broken into two components, lang and parole. Now, lang refers to the actual language and all its grammar and tenses such as English, French, German, etc. And parole refers to the actual spoken utterances. He argued that linguistic signs were made up of two parts, a signifier, the actual word, whether it's verbalised, imagined in its written form, and the signified, which is the actual meaning of the word. So if you think of Kate's example of the chair, the physical object, which tends to have four legs, an area for sitting and a backing, is the signified, whereas the signifier is the actual word chair, which informs us that it's for sitting on. Now, Saussure's theory, which could also be used as a method of analysis, was taken on by many different disciplines and applied in various disciplines such as anthropology, psychology, sociology. Levi Strauss was an anthropologist, and he took on this method of linguistic analysis known as structuralism and applied that to how he interpreted the formation of culture and kinship systems. So he viewed culture as like a language, able to be understood in terms of symbols and signs. For example, who's marriable, who's not. These are cultural norms, but by using structuralism he was able to show why these were cultural norms and what cultural cues were understood to signify these things. Or you could look at his example of foods and what foods are acceptable to be. They're not based on whether foods are inedible, but on cultural preferences. And if you think of all the different types of food across the world, you'll see it's not based on what's edible and what's not edible, it's based on cultural preferences. And by applying structuralism and cultural studies, that allowed us to understand the practices that create these shared cultural practices, effectively making them visible. Structuralism was also taken on and applied in Marxist thought, which was another element in the theoretical background of the school. Now, if you consider the elements we've just discussed, it's very easy to see why structuralism fits so well with cultural theory. There's the implication that you cannot understand one element without its interrelation to the others, the use of signs as conveying meaning, and the non-physical realm in which these interrelationships happen, and the impact they have on our understanding of the physical world. Now, the Centre's work was moored in a literary critical practice. They paid close attention to text, the analysis of immanent forms of meaning, the relationship between symbolic forms and social context, yet it was also heavily informed by Marxist theory as well, and we'll go on to discuss. So the focus of cultural studies shifted, and by the 1960s it began to align itself with Marxism. Marx's emphasis on class relations was fully compatible with the Centre's focus on popular culture as a reflection of the working classes' implicit struggle for self-expression. We're going to see how Marxism influenced the school by looking at two theorists, Gramsci and Althusser. Now, the first one we're going to talk about is Gramsci, and Antonio Gramsci was a cultural Marxist, not a structuralist Marxist. Gramsci developed a theory of ideology and culture which was popularised in Britain by the work of the Birmingham School. Ideology is traditionally an earlier Marxist term to refer to the control of the mental forms of production. Much as the ruling classes have control over the means of production, they also have control over the mental forms of production. Now, in the Marxist economic base and superstructure model of society, base denotes the relations of production and the modes of production, and superstructure denotes the dominant ideology, such as religious, legal, political systems. The economic base of production determines the political superstructure of a society. Ruling class interests determine the superstructure and the nature of the justifying ideology. Actions are feasible because the ruling class control the means of production. So, for example, in a feudal mode of production, religious ideology is the most prominent aspect of the superstructure, while in capitalist formations, ideologies such as liberalism and social democracy dominate. Hence the great importance of the ideology justifying a society. It politically confuses the alienated groups of society via false consciousness, i.e. it's a consciousness forced on them. The ruling class affect their social reproduction by the dominant ideologies, representing to every social economic class that the economic interests of the ruling class are the economic interests of the entire society. Now, Gramsci uses cultural hegemony to explain why the working class have a false ideological conception of what are their best interests. Marx observed, the class which has the means of material production at its disposal has control at the same time over the means of mental production. Now, just to give you a bit more understanding of that, so chronologically, the dominant ideologies in capitalism, which is our current ruling system, are classical liberalism, modern liberalism, social democracy, and then neoliberalism. Now, Gramsci argued to expand this concept of ideology from a set or formal ideas to also include common sense, and by that the latter he means habitual attitudes which have been assimilated from the ruling class ideas, i.e. they appear completely natural to us or commonsensical, yet they actually came into being as artificial concepts that served the purpose of a specific social group. He also removed the concept of ideology from the economic deterministic approach taken by Marx, insisting ideologies were independent of economies, and this belief was also taken on by Althusser. Now, one of Gramsci's ideas was the concept of hegemony, or ideological domination. Basically, when one ideology or worldview dominates, it suppresses or stamps out any other ways of explaining reality. Hegemony can contain a variety of ideologies. Some are artificial, such as theoretical explanations created by academics, political activists or philosophers. Other ideologies are organic, which means that they'll come from the common people's lived experience. And these all consist of a culture's way of seeing and believing, and the institutions that uphold these beliefs, like religion, education, family and the media. Through these beliefs and institutions, society endorses the ethical beliefs and manners which the powers that be agree are true, right, logical or moral. The institutions and beliefs that the dominant culture support are so powerful and get hold of people when they are so young that alternative ways of envisioning reality are very hard to imagine. So this is how hegemony is created and maintained. It's done so legitimately. He argued, although there were oppositional or counter-cultures to the dominant one, all they did was make the hegemonic culture more secure, as by permitting them to exist, the ruling system's legitimised, resulting in it appearing to be a fair and legitimate system. According to Gramsci, hegemony locks up a society even more tightly because of the way ideas are transmitted by language. The word we use to speak and write have been constructed by social interactions through history and shaped by the dominant ideology of the times. Therefore, they're loaded with cultural meanings that condition us to think in particular ways and to not to be able to think very well in other ways. Cultural hegemony therefore refers to the legitimate, complete dominance of one culture over others. For example, if you think of, and this is more a thing of ideology, if you think of when we were discussing films the other day and Paul highlighted how the film Rocky has been changed at the end so that Rocky no longer dedicates his fight to the Taliban. This is a form of hegemonic dominance and a site of ideology as it's done to support the dominant group's interest. Now, moving on to Althusser and his concept of ideology. Although Gramsci was a cultural Marxist, Althusser was a structural Marxist. Now, structural Marxism is an approach to Marxist philosophy based on structuralism, which we were discussing earlier. It's primarily associated with the work of the French philosopher Louis Althusser and his students. It arose in opposition to humanistic Marxism. Althusser stressed that Marxism was a science, and he attempted to reinterpret Marxism in light of the work done by structuralists such as Saussure and Levi Strauss. Althusser focused on the role played by ideology. According to him, it is ideology which shapes our consciousness and social structures. Ideology allows people to imagine that they are making free choices and deciding the course of their lives, when it is in fact the ideology itself which determines the script that they will follow. Now, for Althusser, beliefs and ideas are the products of social practices, not the reverse. What is ultimately ideological for Althusser are not the subjective beliefs held in the conscious minds of human individuals, but rather discourses that produce these beliefs, the material institutions and rituals that individuals take part in without submitting it to conscious examination and critical thinking. So, when discussing Althusser and ideology, we must refer to his understanding of the state and the apparatuses the state uses to maintain hegemony. Unlike Gramsci, Althusser argued that the state became out with the ruling group and operated as a machine, an apparatus on its own. He defines the state as a machine of repression which enables the ruling classes to ensure their domination over the working class, thus enabling the former to subject the latter to capitalist exploitation. The state, in other words, is to Althusser a tool of the dominant classes in their struggle for and maintenance of hegemony. It is in effect the formally and officially legitimated body that executes the domination of the ruling classes, which enables its extraction of surplus value from its exploitation of the working classes. The difference with Althusser, however, is that unlike Gramsci, the state's no mere tool of the classes, who, despite great structural battles, nonetheless remain, as it were, the protagonists, playing the role of the main characters. And in this sense, Gramsci is still a humanist, whereas with Althusser, the state, as the structural arrangement determined by the power struggle, gains a life of its own, hence Althusser being a structuralist. Beyond the control of the classes. Now, building on Gramsci's concept of ideology, Althusser articulated two types of apparatuses for maintaining dominance. The state consists of two bodies, two types of apparatuses. First, there is the repressive state apparatus, the RSA, which can be termed the state proper, and refers to the current legitimate ruling systems which control society, such as the law, government, police, etc. Althusser explains that this term means not only the specialised apparatus whose existence and necessity are recognised in relation to the requirements of legal practice, i.e. the police, the courts, the prisons, but also the army, which intervenes directly as a supplementary repressive force in the last instance when the police and its specialised auxiliary corps are outrun by events. And above these groups, there's the head of the state, the government and the administration. Now, this apparatus is repressive because it functions by violence, it uses force. Althusser referred to the ideological state apparatuses, which were state organisations that perpetuated the specific ideological systems and helped impose them onto people. Social control is much more effective when it's self-imposed, and the functions of the ISA are vital in capitalist societies. Institutions such as the family, schools, religion, mass media, urban myths, art, political ideas, these all form from the ISAs. If they fail in social control, then capitalist states must employ the RSAs. And this view really makes people seem very much like puppets under the control of the state. And a key point of contention in this developing concept is how much ordinary people can resist, negotiate or refashion ideology on their own, or whether only cultural critics, armed with analytical tools for unmasking these normalising functions of ideologies and discourses, can successfully play this role. So Stuart Hall and the school took on that view of resistance and used it to explore different types of resistance to the state and its hegemony. And when Hall took over from the centre from Hogarth in the 70s, they began to examine the relations between the media and ideology through the analysis of signifying systems in texts known as discourses. Okay, so now I'm going to discuss some of the research done by the school, and I'm going to concentrate on my own field, which is youth, as the school made many contributions to the field of youth studies. Now, Stuart Hall and Tony Jefferson described youth subcultures as symbolic or ritualistic attempts to resist the power of bourgeoisie hegemony by consciously adopting behaviour that appears threatening to the establishment. Much theory concerning youth culture in Britain originated from the CCCS and a collection of essays called Resistance Through Rituals. Now, it's generally accepted that most research in youth cultures in Britain was established and influenced by the school. The approach to the study of youth was similar to that of the Chicago School in looking at subcultures or worlds within worlds, but the school posited a new way forward that managed to leave behind the negative discourses of deviance or delinquency that the Chicago School went down. Phil Cohen posited a way that argued delinquency and subcultures were two separate concepts. He posited that subcultures were able to resolve social problems through magical solutions and imaginary relations, and it was on the basis of this tenet that the theoretical framework for the study of youth was formed. And I'd just like to take you a wee minute so that you can read the quote. The concept of subculture at its base is concerned with agency and action, belonging to a subset or social group that is distinct from but related to the dominant culture. Its value for a model of explanation rests with its capacity to describe forms of solidarity that contrast with the dominant norms and values of society. And it's on this basis youth subcultures are interpreted as a language. The meaning of their style is imaginary. That is to say, it is real and that it derives from their contradictory class position, but young people are not fully aware of this repression. It is only fully realised in their semiotic displays of subcultural style. Working class youths, through their subcultures, attempt to resolve ideological contradictions that remain hidden or unresolved in the parent culture. The basic assumption is that youth subcultures belong to the working class, deriving from the experience of subordination. Now, Clark, Hall, Jefferson and Roberts built on Cohen's work and provided a more nuanced theoretical overview of youth class cultures and subcultures, and this provided much of the theoretical framework for the study of youth in Britain until the early 80s. Resistance Through Rituals, which you can see in the background of the slide here, was their seminal text. Its theoretical teachings were rooted in structuralist Marxism, highlighting the important interplay of structure and culture in a young person's life. The theories were rooted in class conflict and posit that through subcultures young people manage to abate class tensions through various forms of cultural resistance. They argued young people are agents of social change, operating between the mass culture, which they referred to as the dominant culture, and that is the culture shared and accepted by all society, to which all members of that society subscribe to, and their parent culture, which is, for example, working class and middle class culture. And they would create their own subcultures in opposition to the parent culture, utilising tenets of both their parent and mass culture to create their own microculture, which the school termed a subculture. Now, the school put forward various examples of subcultures, highlighting how they would resist dominant cultures through various symbolic styles. Yet this in itself was problematic, and rather than giving a widespread view of differing youth groups, they tended to concentrate on the spectacular elements of working class deviant boys, and it was this concentration which limited the contribution they were making. The subcultural perspective was central in youth culture in the 60s, 70s and 80s, but then began to decline for various reasons in place of things such as tribes, identity and styles. Now, there was various reasons for this. school's concentration upon class tensions, the rise of criminology, the rise of post-subcultures, such as I was discussing earlier, such as the tribes, the impact in post-subcultures, and the impact of wider social issues such as post-modernity. There was also focused political attention upon other issues such as youth unemployment, resulting in dominance of the structural approach and a concentration on transitions in the early 80s. So if you are interested, the topic is hotly debated in academia at this moment as to whether subcultures are still a relevant form of theorising about young people, with some people such as Shildrick and MacDonald arguing that class is still central in young people's lives, and others taking a more postmodern view, such as Redhead or Muggleton, that we are able to create our own identities regardless of class. We'll go further into this next week when we're going to be discussing postmodernity. This is one example of the studies. Dick Hebdage study subculture. The meaning of style is an example of the study of youth subcultures by the school. Hebdage put forward that punk culture was a form of resistance to the dominant cultural values of British society in the late 70s. Hebdage argued that subcultures operate by identifying contradictions in the dominant culture and then subverting them. Hebdage explains that symbolism and the style of punk rock, such as safety pins in the nose, crazy hairstyles, bad names such as Johnny Rotten, Sid Vicious, etc., reflected deep cultural resistances to the dominant culture. Now, if you think about Britain in the late 70s, it was a society in economic and cultural decline, not much to offer the working class youth, unprecedented levels of youth unemployment, and the punks took these signs and they reflected society, the ugliness that they were living in, and they took existing everyday objects and imbued them with a sense of cultural meaning that Hebdage termed bricolage. So, for example, the safety pins, they were now jewellery rather than being for holding clothes together, and that was what he termed bricolage. But, as Hebdage points out, subcultures in a capitalist society, whilst they legitimate what we were talking about earlier, the cultural hegemony by their existence, they are sooner or later incorporated into the dominant culture. And he argued that this occurs in two ways. The elements of the subculture, the elements of the subculture are commodified and turned into consumer objects, such as the bands like the Sex Pistols getting signed to recording labels and required to make more records to fit with the auspices of the label, or punk clothes becoming mass products and being taken on by fashion shops and prices increasing, and then ultimately the punk is ideologically labelled and redefined, given a different meaning by the masses, ultimately ensuring that the subculture is absorbed into the dominant culture. Now, there were various criticisms of the centre. Despite the emergence of subcultural theory out of wider political and cultural movements of the 60s and 70s, such as feminism, anti-racism, women and black youth received at best only partial treatment in early subcultural studies, obviously outside the obvious contributions of McRobbie and Garber and the later volume, CCS volume The Empire Strikes Back. Now, this was always a criticism of the school, as with its focus on distinct spectacular white working class groups such as punks, they did not include other groups in their analysis. It's been argued they backed the wrong horse in embracing the tradition of Western Marxism, which led it to overly focus upon these white working classes and the state, and it made them slow to understand identity politics or corporate capitalism. It made it less receptive to globalisation and exaggerated the importance of the nation state. It was also said the school had an insistence on relevance, which promoted a need to be an expert on what's happening now, and this tends to get in the way of better grounding its own approach and developing a strong disciplinary base, which inevitably leads to a reoccurring tendency to reinvent the wheel intellectually. They also had a tendency to produce cultural relativism. They failed to develop an adequate position on cultural value. thinking everything's important. And I want you to think a few minutes on this. Can everything be important at the same time? Is there value of one above the other? But considering the outputs and the influence the centre had on cultural studies, I decided we should end on its contributions rather than its criticisms, and we'll now look at this part of it. Now, rather than go through all the academic contributions and their contemporary permeations, I wanted to concentrate on the more abstract contributions that the school added, otherwise we would be here all day. One of the most important things for me that the school managed to introduce was the radical concepts we discussed earlier. And they managed to take these concepts, which were very radical, very different, difficult to discuss, and they managed to make them mainstream. They broke down the barriers between academic disciplines and managed to get these messages across to mainstream audiences, so others within academia started critically looking at issues such as race, femininity, class, ideologies, and this created a whole host of other studies which all contributed to our shared knowledge. The school managed to create a cross-disciplinary centre, and that was unheard of at its time, as you'll probably see from the reading I gave you. If you click on the link on the middle page and read the history element of why the school was shut, you'll see that really was something new in its time. And this cross-disciplinary centre had a terrific output of research, again something that was unheard of at the centre's time of conception. They also managed to bring culture into the political realm by drawing upon structuralism and Marxism to reinvent new methods of analysis and create new and innovative ways of researching text, youth, mass media and popular culture. Now, this is something that's largely missing in the field of cultural studies. Some disciplines, such as media studies, still apply their analysis of ideology in reviewing TV shows, but in the main, politics is no longer within the cultural realm. But above all, they inspired academics to rethink how they approach society and understanding and created a new way in which researchers could engage with the social world. So I think the centre's achievements far outweigh its criticisms. Now, reference list for the lecture. I've included a bibliography, as I have utilised various articles and resources and books in creating this lecture, and I thought it best that you have them up so that if there are further areas of interest to you, you would be able to follow them up. If you are looking for any further reading or more contemporary readings on it, please get in contact with me, especially if it's to do with youth subcultures. As I said earlier, that tends to be where my loyalties lie. So thank you very much for taking the time to listen to me today.